Good morning, y'all. Well, I promised it, and here it is. This is part 2 of So You Want to Be a Shepherd. Today we're going to cover mating, lambing, aftercare for lambing, lambs in general, and winter. It's a bit to get through, but it's good information if you're thinking about it. It's a great starting place. If it all sounds like too much, hey, you just leave it to me and the other professionals, okay? We'll take care of it. All right, let's get going. What does it take to get those adorable little lambs running around your pasture? Just like everything else, you're going to need a mommy sheep and a daddy sheep, also called a ewe and a ram, respectively. Ewes are easy to keep. Those are typically what most people's flocks largely consist of because you want to have a lot of mothers. And they are gentle, usually. They flock together. They're just good critters to have. Rams are okay. While they will be affectionate, they do tend to get a little aggressive as they get older. They will ram you if you're not watching them. A lot of people will keep 1 or 2 rams of good stock for breeding purposes. Even if you don't want to keep a ram, you can hire in a stud ram. I do a little bit of both. We have a ram here and we bring in stud rams. I work with some of my neighbors so that we can try to keep the gene pool fresh. Even as I record this, I have a stud ram from another farm in my field, even though I have a ram here. He's related to about half of the ewes, though. I'm sure you see the problem. He will probably spend some time at a neighboring farm just to avoid any inbreeding situations. That's a whole other thing. You do want to try to avoid inbreeding. Inbreeding would be brother to sister breeding. There is a practice known as line breeding, where you breed offspring back to a parent animal. However, it is fraught with difficulties as well. You need to be careful, and I really wouldn't recommend it for a beginner. I just don't feel knowledgeable enough to do it. I suppose in a pinch, I could try to make it work. The simple solution is to find a stud in your area and hire him in to your farm for a period of time, at least a month or so, to make sure he makes friends and does his job. Just be mindful that whenever you bring a new animal onto the farm, you need to be careful about bringing in additional parasites from other farms. You could accidentally bring illness into your farm, or you could spread illness to other people's farms. Typically, people will use a hoof bath for this. It's just a trough that the animals are forced to walk through before they get on the ground at your farm or leave your farm, and it has some pretty potent disinfectants in it and antimicrobials. I don't use one of these, but that's because the farms that I work with, I've been working with for years before I knew about such things, and we've already shared all the stuff we're going to share probably. The actual process of breeding them is pretty straightforward. You don't want to have any other additional rams in their flock when you put a stud out there, because they will start butting heads and they can break each other's necks. We've had that happen. That's a nightmare because then you need to butcher an animal right then. Hope you didn't have plans. But really, it's as simple as releasing a stud ram into your flock of ewes and making sure there's no other rams in there, and making sure there are no ewes that you do not want bred in that flock. Give him a month or so, and he'll manage, as long as his tackle's working properly. Exact gestation time is somewhat variable between the breeds. It's in the ballpark of 4 months. Google the names of your breed and try to get an exact gestation period for them. It's hard to nail down exactly because you don't know if your ram was able to mate with a particular ewe on the second day of him being there or on the last day of him being there. And so you can have a pretty wide variegation there. Now, you can certainly employ a veterinarian to come out and do pregnancy testing or even ultrasonography. Again, for me, the cost benefit is not really there, and I don't have time to chase all my ewes down and test them individually. We have a pretty good success rate, and I just kind of hope that continues. If I start to have problems, then I may look into testing. We breed our sheep in the autumn or early winter every year. This ensures that we will have lambs either late winter or early spring. That timing has worked well for us. Again, I mentioned in the last video we had an Arctic blast come through, and even in temperatures much harsher than we're used to in this area, we did not lose a single lamb despite having like a dozen lambs on the ground. That was pretty awesome. They're pretty resilient. Now, I was feeding them a lot of food and going out of my way a lot to make sure they were taken care of. So for us, lambing falls in the springtime or late winter. This is always a fun and stressful time. Usually, once you've had a flock for a few years, you'll have some good mothers and you won't have to worry about them as much. But early on, and with any young mothers or untested mothers, you have to watch them. You have to learn to watch for their lambing behavior. It's hard to describe, it doesn't sound very distinctive, but when you see it, you'll know it. They tend to walk around, walk in circles, paw the ground, lay down, stand up, lay down, stand up, lay down, stand up. And that's how you know it's about time, and you're probably going to have some baby lambs. Now, if you have trained your sheep to the hand really well, your ewes might tolerate you going right out to them and checking on them, making sure that the lamb is coming out properly. My ewes tend to be pretty skittish, and they have to be kind of far along or fatigued in the process for them to let me lay hold of them. That being said, my lovely wife is much better at it, and usually I'm at work anyway. So when she sees them doing this, she tries to either coax them into the small shelters where they will sit with their lambs, or we wait until they have a lamb and then we use the lamb to draw the mother into the shelter. This works well, except when something is not proceeding properly. This has happened occasionally. If you can see that part of the lamb is protruding from its mother, in other words, the amniotic sac has been ruptured, that lamb ought to be born within an hour. If it's not within an hour, you probably should consider intervening at that point. In the past, we have needed to assist a ewe who was having difficulty lambing every time it was a first-time mother or a mother of small stature, and we were lucky that each time it was the classic presentation of the hooves forward. There are techniques where you help get the lamb out of the mother when the mother is obviously becoming fatigued or the lamb is stuck. However, I feel like those are beyond the scope of this video, and I would highly recommend that prior to your lambing time, you consult a veterinarian so that you are adequately prepared. Because not only can the lamb die, but the ewe can die as well. You do need to monitor your ewes for a day or so and try to make sure that the placenta has passed as well. Usually one of my dogs finds it, and there you go. So this is one of those things that everybody does it differently. What we do on our farm is when a lamb is born, we will pick it up and the mom will come to it most of the time. So if you can catch the lamb and hold it down on the ground, it's funny, you have to hold the lamb down near the ground. If you hold it up out of the mom's line of sight, the mom struggles with the object permanence, like the lamb is just gone. So you have to hold it down where she can see it and back into one of the shelters, set the lamb down, and the mom will usually go in there. And then you close the door behind her. Make sure that she has some good bedding, water, and either some nutritious hay for her to eat or a grain mix, whatever they're typically eating. We will typically keep you and the lambs in a pretty small pen together for a week. This serves two purposes. This helps the babies to not expend a bunch of unnecessary energy trying to get colostrum from the mom, and it discourages the mom from wandering off from the babies. And finally, it firmly helps the mom to imprint on the baby. This is really important, especially when you get multiple lambs out in the field. Some people don't do any of that. They just let them drop in the field and babies either sink or swim. You can do it that way. You're gonna lose a few more. Occasionally you will get a mom that will drop her baby in the field and then walk away and not want to have anything to do with it. Even if you catch her and put her in a pen and put the baby in there, she will headbutt the baby. If you leave it in there, she will kill it. She doesn't want anything to do with it. Those are bad moms, and you should consider culling them. They're not going to add to the quality of your flock. However, it does give you an opportunity to bottle raise a lamb. Bottle raising can be really tough. Again, you're going to have to do your research. I'm not going to sit here and outline the process, but it does involve frequent feedings. Do not get the general milk replacer that is sold at the farm stores. You need to specifically get the lamb milk replacer. Also, with newborns, you need to get the lamb colostrum replacer and use both of those products as described on the package. It's really important to get the ones that are specific for lambs. We tried the general, it just does not work. I later found out that that doesn't work for anybody, so don't do it. Even though the package says it works for lambs, it does not. During that first week, while they're in the small shelters with their mom, this is also called a jug, or jugging the mom and the baby together. This is the time you need to consider whether or not you're going to tag these lambs and whether or not you're going to band them. Tagging is always a good idea because it helps you to identify and keep good records. That's something we do. It's essentially piercing the ear. That's all it is. The official recommendations from some of the hoity-toity organizations for sheep, they recommend tagging both ears with small tags, specifically sheep tags, and I have to say that's a good idea. I use small tags, but they're not as small as the sheep tags, and we do have a pretty fair rate of the sheep tearing them out. But that's also why they recommend tagging both ears, so that if one is torn out, you still have the other as a backup to identify them. I gotta say, that's logical. I should probably start doing that. Maybe next year. You do want to make sure it's a relatively clean process. I wouldn't go as far as to say sterile, but I usually keep rubbing alcohol in a spray bottle and try to sanitize things as best I can. You do have to be careful because some of the inks will run if you get the alcohol on them, and that's just annoying and problematic, but it's good for records. Now, banding is a whole other question. Some people don't want to do banding. They consider it inhumane. I gotta say, I wouldn't like it myself, but it can be done several different ways. What we have here is the small elastic bands. There's a little hand tool that stretches it out so that you can fit it over the scrotum, making sure the testicles are descended into the scrotum, and then you close it down and wiggle the tool off, and over the next day or two the blood supply is cut off to the testicles and the scrotum, and they will shrivel and die and fall off. Yep, that's what happens. There are other methods. I'll leave it to you to Google them. So why do we do it? We band ram lambs when they are definitely destined to be processed for meat. Rams, you will find, have a musk about them. It's not as bad as, say, a buck or a billy goat, but it is noticeably pungent. And that musk can get into the meat. And boy, let me tell you, it can be almost offensive at times. This tends to be worse with wool sheep in general. When it comes time to processing, you will be glad that you did it. Some recommendations include giving them an antibiotic shot during this time or a tetanus shot just to fend off illness. At this time, we do not do that on our farm. If it starts to become a problem, we will look at it. I've not had any problems with banding yet. So, past this point, it really is just rotational grazing throughout the summer, appropriate supplementation, trying to make sure they're safe, fed, and healthy and happy and enjoying it. Guys, when you have the lambs on your property, go out, especially in the evening, right before twilight, and just watch your lambs. They will start running around, romping, jumping, frolicking. It is good for the soul, I tell you what. Let that go on all summer. Some people make it a point to wean at a certain time. On our farm, we don't bother with it. I just let nature take its course, and they wean themselves naturally. I think it's 3 months in. I'm not sure. You'll need to do your research. I don't deal with it. And before you know it, autumn will be here, and your lambs ought to be hopefully in the 100-pound range, 100 to 150 pounds. Mine tend to be on the small side. I'm hoping to change that by changing some of my supplementation practices, increasing the protein like I've mentioned. But it's time to consider who's going to freezer camp. That's a euphemistic way of saying having them butchered. So it can be tough if you're sentimental like that. Around here, we're pretty pragmatic about it. Not going to say we're cold. It's something we take seriously, but it is something that we raise them for. That's the purpose of them being here. We are acutely aware that they have to lose their life for us to continue ours. And every person who eats meat should be aware of that. Not to feel guilty, but just to realize the gravity of something as simple as meat in your meal. So, do not wait until the last minute to call a butcher and ask them if they can butcher your animal. Ideally, you would be calling them when your animals are born, back in spring. Ideally, with livestock, whenever they're born, they get a birthday, and then they get a butcher day. Call around, compare prices, make sure you understand what they expect of you, what you can expect from them. All meat processing facilities are slightly different, and it can be very frustrating and confusing. Take notes. Call them. If you're not sure, call them back. If they're rude to you, call someone else. It's that simple. And be willing to drive, because a lot of times you have to drive quite a ways to get your animals processed. But a good processor is totally worth it. Some things you really want to find out: what you will need to pick up from them. We used to work with a processor who, the rendering plant that would take all of the leftovers, if you will, from all of their processing would not take anything from sheep. And so whenever I would take sheep up there, they were happy to process them, but then I had to go up there the next day to pick up the heads, hooves, and hides of all my animals and then bring them back to my land and bury them myself. While manageable, it was quite the chore. Thank God they kept the intestines and things. I don't know what they did with them, and I don't care, but I didn't have to deal with those. Something else you want to check on is make sure that you know if they have facilities that you can drop off your animal the night before, when your animal needs to be dropped off specifically, when you can expect to pick up the meat specifically. Of course, you'll go over what we call cut sheets, where you define what you're going to get from the animal, be it a roast, chops, etc., things like that. Again, if you're not sure, call them and ask them to talk you through it. If they're not willing to do that, you should probably find somebody else. And perhaps most importantly is you need to be aware of minimum costs. A lot of times, butcher costs are determined by what's called hanging weight. That is when you get an animal that has been gutted, the head is removed, the hooves are removed, the hide is removed, and you're left with most of the skeleton and the muscles. A lot of times they'll give you a price per pound based on the hanging weight. But if your lambs are on the smaller side, lambs or pigs or anything, they may have what's called a minimum. They'll say it's this much per hanging weight or $100. Sometimes that's not worth it. Now you can certainly process lambs yourself. We've only done it a couple times and I don't feel like I am qualified to give a primer on it other than to say the obvious things. Dispatch them humanely, do it in a clean area, and do it quickly so as not to let the meat go bad. Package well and freeze quickly. Do your research, and this video is not going to count as research for that. All of that being said, having lamb meat in your freezer is very, very rewarding. And a lot of city folk, they have to pay a lot to eat lamb. I mean, we're talking 14 to 20 bucks a pound, and that's our primary red meat that we eat on our farm. We eat it all the time. So, you know, we're pretty bougie like that. All right, finally, I want to talk about winter real quick because immediately following harvest season is winter. Sheep do really well in the cold. In general, adult sheep do very well in the cold. You do want to make sure they have shelter. Ideally, you want a good wind block from the prevailing winter winds. Probably the next most important thing is making sure they have a good source of liquid water. This takes many forms. For years, I used wash basins and they would freeze overnight. I would go down there with jugs of water that I filled up in the house because I couldn't use my hoses. And I would use my walking stick to break up the water, a sieve to remove the floating ice, and refill it with liquid water. And as soon as I backed off from what I was doing, they would come over there and drink the water. If you have a pond, same principle, except for you don't have to carry water down there. You go down there daily, break up some ice, sieve some of it off so that they can get in there and drink it. And be careful doing that. Don't fall in your frozen pond. Lord Almighty, don't do that. If you can, go with a buddy. Just do it safely. Most recently, we have learned that we are just going to use the paddocks that are near the house, and I can run an extension cord out there and use something called a stock tank warmer. Oh my goodness, people, this thing changed my life. While I do have to carry a jug of water out there every day, or twice or 3 times a day, the stock tank warmer keeps it liquid for the animals all the time. Even in our really cold weather, down into the negative teens Fahrenheit that we experienced this last year, the stock tanks never completely froze over. That was pretty epic. If you want my opinion, try to run your sheep where you can get an extension cord there. And of course, you're going to need to supplement. We've already talked about hay and dietary supplements. Really, none of that changes. You just can't depend on forage. So you're going to supply a lot of hay. Make sure you are supplying adequate supplementation as far as protein and minerals. And that's really all there is to it. Just never take them for granted. Check on your animals every day, if not twice a day. It goes for all of your animals though. And there's a lot of special circumstances that I kind of had to gloss over, and some that I didn't even mention. But this is a nice primer to get people started, and I hope it answers the questions for my loyal subscribers and commenters. I appreciate you guys. You really are just wonderful people, and you make all this work totally worth it. Please share the videos, share the channel with like-minded folks. As I've been trying to say in every video, please support your local producers and oppose anything that impedes your access to locally produced foods. Protect your local food supply. This is vitally important for communities across our country, across the world. And thanks for coming by, y'all.